Good morning, and again, welcome to our Sunday morning service. My name is Matt, for any of you guys who don't know me. And I'm doing part two on a series, an ongoing series on the letter to the church in Ephasis, commonly known as the book of Ephesians, that Tim kindly kicked off last week. And as you've just heard read out, I'm looking at chapter 1, verses 15 to 23. And again, if you've got your Bibles with you this morning, I would strongly encourage you to turn to that cluster of 8 or so verses, because it's quite dense. It's quite dense. So it's worth having it there in front of you so you can go through it with me as I hopefully unpack it. So that's Ephesians chapter 1, verses 15 through to 23. Now, I really I like reading biographies or autobiographies of musicians. And I devoured one recently of a guy called Mark Lanigan. So he was part of the 90s, as in the 1990s, grunge scene in Seattle. So he was a peer, a contemporary of bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, all that kind of stuff. And this autobiography, so it was written by him, it started off detailing his childhood from roughly around the age of 12 and ended up around about 1997. And over the course of his years, he came from a very troubled background. He was a kind of described alcoholic at the age of 12. And then in the middle, he found world fame. He was touring around the world with his band, The Screaming Trees. And then at the end, in the kind of mid to late 90s, he was a homeless, self-described junkie who had a raging heroin addiction, who'd sold all his possessions to fund his habit. He was in fear of losing his life from dealers that he'd ripped off, and he was being hounded by the police who were trying to get him into jail. He'd lost friends like Kurt Cobain due to mental health issues and fame, and he'd literally almost lost some of his limbs from the sores and the infections from injecting over time. So he was at the absolute end of his tether. But almost miraculously, out of nowhere, Courtney Love, the widow of Kurt Cobain and another fellow rock star, she gave him a last chance out of the blue. She paid him to get off the street, out of the city, and into a rehab centre, catering for musicians specifically. But even there, when he checked in, he didn't think he was going to make it because he'd been through multiple attempts at rehab. He'd failed to quit plenty of times before. So, out of sheer desperation, he prays to a God he doesn't really believe in, doesn't have a religious background whatsoever, only bad experiences. And he says, pretty much, save me, deliver me from this because I can't do it myself. And he writes that instantaneously, he has this undeniable, life-changing experience that he feels. It's tangible. And he doesn't go into details and kind of describe what it was, and he still says that he doesn't believe in organised religion, etc., etc. But he's been clean, I believe, since the 90s and is still making music today. So he was a guy who felt that he was in the grip of powers that were out to harm him and that he couldn't defeat in his own strength. He tried to overcome them before in his own power, but couldn't. And then he reaches out to God, who, as it turns out, is even more powerful than his circumstances, his addictions, his past, and whatever dark spiritual forces that can lurk behind addictions and self-destructive behaviour. That's a cool story, isn't it? That's a really cool story. Now, Christian or not, we may actually find it hard sometimes to, and I don't know, again, if you're Christian, then you'll kind of give this lip service, but sometimes I think in our lived experience, it's sometimes actually hard to believe in spiritual forces or supernatural powers. Angels and demons, stuff like that. We don't follow Artemis, which was the god, probably the most popular god or deity that the Ephesians, in the time that the letter was written, would have been following. And we don't pay worship to Roman emperors, the way, again, that a lot of the Ephesians at the time of this letter would have done. But instead, I'd suggest we still, to some degree, we still believe in things like luck, fortune, and fate. Sometimes we can regard it as fickle, impersonal, and faceless, but nevertheless, we think it's powerful. So just consider it for a second. Have you ever found yourself kind of, stopping to worry that when everything is going well in your life, you can still find yourself concerned about the other shoe dropping? You start to think that, things are just going too good for me at the moment. some force is going to turn circumstances against me and it's going to go the other way. Enter the writer of Ephesians. His perspective is radically different from this. If you're worried, fearful, anxious about the future, about being at the mercy of dark powers beyond your control, he says, don't. Because God, not dark powers, not faceless impersonal fate or fortune or luck, not even your addictions or your past, none of that stuff is actually in control. As powerful and real as dark powers are, God is so much more powerful and has already demonstrated this through his raising Jesus Christ from the dead. That is the big point of these 8 verses right there. And the author, he makes this point through, of all things, a prayer. That's what really like these 8 verses are, a prayer. And let's assume for the rest of the talk that it's Paul was the author. It's a really decent length prayer that he makes, again, from verses 15 to 23. And it's in 3 parts, basically. First of all, he gives a quick thanksgiving. And then he moves into a petition or a kind of an intercession on behalf of the people that he's writing to. And then he brings it all together by refocusing their attention on God's power. For the rest of this talk, I'll be pretty much looking at that last one, the refocus on God's power and the way that he reminds his audience in different ways of what God has already done. That's going to be the focus of this talk. Now, as well as being a really good counter for worry and stress about being at the mercy of dark powers, this is just a great example of how to pray for people as well. It's a great kind of exemplary prayer of what to pray for each other. So take it on board in that regard too. Okay, so here we go. In verse 15, you'll see that he starts off by giving thanks to God for his brothers and sisters. And then he moves into praying for them. So this is his petition, if you like, to God. And look exactly at what he prays for them. And again, remember that this was likely to be a circular letter. It was written for a general audience, not one specific church going through a specific set of circumstances, difficult circumstances, but something that was probably meant to be passed around. So this prayer, it's almost like a template. It's not addressed to meet specific needs. So this is what Paul prays. At verse 17 there, you'll see a summary. For this reason, ever since I heard about your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love for all God's people. That's what he prays. That's the start. And then he moves on. I keep asking that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the glorious Father, may give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation so that you may know him better. In other words, Paul's prayer, the summary of his prayer for these people is this. Dear God, please help these people who already know you even better. Paul is praying for a stronger relationship, for more intimacy. And this is worth noting, right? He doesn't pray for help them have more knowledge for knowledge's sake. He doesn't even pray help them be more moral, if you like, help their character resemble yours more for its own sake. Instead, he wants the relationship to further. And then he describes how this will come about. So again, if you look at verse 17, it's via the spirit of wisdom and revelation. Wisdom and revelation. Now, sometimes when we use that word spirit, we're kind of referring to an internal state. So I've got a spirit of courage, I'd like a spirit of forgiveness, etc., etc. But here, given the context and the fact that he mentions the term revelation, Paul is probably referring to the Holy Spirit. So it's the Holy Spirit, that third member of the Godhead, who will further our knowing God and allow us to know him better and better. And then in verse 18, moving on, Paul gives us 3 things to be reminded of. And these are really what I want to focus on for the remainder of the talk. 3 things to be reminded of and to know and to believe more deeply. But before he gets there, he writes that he wants the eyes of our heart to be enlightened. And again, it's worth remembering that in the context of the New Testament and the Old, the heart isn't just the seat of our emotions. It's not just our feelings. It's the center of the whole person. So our thoughts, our attitude, our intellect, our beliefs, as well as our feelings. So what Paul is asking is that he wants us to really get, to know, to be convinced of the following 3 things. And first of all, it's the hope to which God has called us. So that begs the question, what's the hope? And it's probably the hope that Paul mentions back in verse 10 of chapter 1. And that is the hope that all things in heaven and earth will be brought together under one head, even Christ. So the hope that he's reminding us of, that we're called to, is that one day in the future, the now and not yet kingdom will be all now. It'll be all present. And it'll be ruled over by God and his love and perfection. So this is really a future-oriented hope that one day all really will be well. And if you think about it, even though this is future-oriented, it really matters to our present. So think of a movie for a second, or movies in general. So much of what we think about a movie, I think, comes down to its ending, how it's resolved, if you like. If you know in advance that the movie you're watching has a happy as opposed to a tragic ending, it'll influence how you experience that movie even before you get to the end. Before, perhaps, you even know the details of how it's going to conclude. So you experience the present to some degree in light of the ending. The future, if you like, can actually influence the present. So, for example, take two classic war movies, Apocalypse Now from the 70s and Saving Private Ryan from the 90s. Both are harrowing in their portrayal of the horrors of war. Both involve their protagonists and other characters suffering along the way. Both belong to the same genre, if you like. They're both dramas, they're both war movies. But we experience them, if you've seen both of them, so differently. And that's largely, I'd argue, due to the ending, due to how they're both resolved. One, that is Saving Private Ryan, is redemptive, if you like. And the other, Apocalypse Now, well, if you haven't seen it, I won't ruin it for you, but let's just say you'll probably never want to take a riverboat cruise again. But very, very, very different. Yeah, but in terms of what happens in the narrative all the way up to the end, so similar. Our life, I'd suggest, is again like that. Regardless of the trials we face, Paul reminds us of how the cosmic story that we're just a small part of is going to end, or at least this chapter of it. And that is a cause for hope. That future influences how we live in the present. So that's the first reminder. The second reminder Paul gives us is that we, who he refers to, flatteringly enough, as the saints in verse 18, we are God's glorious inheritance. That is, like it reads in verse 14 of the same chapter, we are God's possession. That's the line that he uses. We are God's possession. And I think you can infer there, and by other parts of Scripture, not just a possession that he's ambivalent about, but in fact a treasured possession. His glorious, in fact, possession. So Paul reminds his readers of the fact that they are valued by God. We are God's valuable inheritance by virtue of being his children, as it refers to in the first 5 verses. And the last reminder, so that's the second, is this section that Paul gives us, is of God's incomparably great power for those who believe. And he uses a bunch of terms to just re-emphasize and reinforce how powerful this is. The power is like the working of his mighty strength. So look at some of these terms. His incomparably great power for us who believe. So we've got words like incomparably, great, mighty, strength, power. So what is Paul trying to impress upon his readers here? What does he want them to really believe in their heart, as in with their whole person, their whole being? Is the hope in this that you are God's, in verse 17 referred to as glorious Father. So is the hope you are God's, your glorious Father's treasured possession, his glorious inheritance. And your glorious Father, whose treasured possession you are, he is it loving? That's true, he is loving. But that's not front and center in this passage. Is it the fact that God, your glorious Father, is wise? Again, that's true, but it's not what is in focus here. Here, the characteristic that Paul is trying to emphasize and push forward about our glorious Father whose cherished possession we are, the characteristic is power. He wants to let us know just how powerful our Father is. That's what he wants us to get as a conviction with our whole being, his power. And that power, Paul says, has been supremely demonstrated, you'll read in verse 20, by Christ being raised from the dead and then exalted to a place of authority. And again, you can see the emphasis that Paul places on that authority, because Christ is seated at the right hand of God. And in the ancient world, that was a special position of supreme hierarchy, if you like, being the top of the food chain, if you could be seated next to the monarch on the right-hand side. And again, it's a position of power. Paul stresses that it is far above every rule, every authority, every power and dominion and title that can be given. And he emphasises it's not just now in this age, but in the age to come. And further, Paul notes God has placed everything under his, that is Jesus' feet. Now it's worth pointing out the fact that the list of titles that you'll read there in verse 21, every rule, every authority, every power and dominion, every title that can be given. These are referring primarily to spiritual forces as opposed to physical, temporal structures. And as we've already discussed, like the audience at the time who would have been reading this originally, they would have been living in fear of the popular gods, the spirit, the supernatural powers of the day. And Paul is making it abundantly clear to them that as Christians, as God's cherished possession and inheritance, they've got no reason to be intimidated. To stick with the same metaphor that he uses, these very real, powerful dark forces have been subjugated and now are effectively Jesus' footrest. That's the impression. That's the picture. That's how well and how entirely they've been dealt with and defeated. So for us here and now, this prayer should still first and foremost be a message of encouragement. There is no sinister or even ambivalent force of fate, luck, fortune, more powerful than our glorious Father. As his child, you're his treasured possession, part of his glorious inheritance. Nothing can happen to us that can't be used for our good and his glory. And look, I know this can just roll off the tongue so tritely, right? But I know that in lived experience, it's so easy to despair at times, whether it be due to that relationship breakdown or that recent diagnoses or that global pandemic. All these things are real. And all these things are sometimes insurmountable when they're stacked up next to our own resources, our own strength. But look again at that ultimate example of God's power in 19 and 20. God raised the dead. God brings back to life. God resurrects. Your particular situation may seem dire and appear hopeless, but this example reminds us that even if there's no cause for hope, even if hope itself is dead, God's power can bring back that which is dead. It can bring it back to life. Do you remember that's a little account, I can't remember in which gospel it is, but I think it's the father whose child was on the brink of death, and he comes to Jesus, and Jesus asks him, do you have faith? Do you believe? And this guy says, it's such a good prayer, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. That's so true, right? Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. And so Paul is saying, again, reminding his readers, this is the cause you've got to believe. God is in the resurrection business. And not only that, he doesn't just bring things back to the state they were before. He's just not about restoration. He's about making things even better. So tough, challenging, and bad things will happen to us. But even the bad things are contained, if you like. They've got borders around them. They're part of a broader plan and purpose. And that broader plan and purpose is dictated by this glorious Father whose treasured possession we are. That's the encouragement. But this prayer, I think it also contains a kind of implicit warning. And it's kind of there hidden, if you like, in that mention of darker spiritual forces and powers. So regardless if you're a Christian or not, just please give this some thought. What is your buttress? What's your fail-safe against fate, fortune, or luck? Whose power are you going to fall back on when things become hard and things clearly happen or impact you that are beyond your control? Because we all know that eventually they will. Now, you're probably not going to end up like Mark Lanigan, living on the streets in the throes of addiction and having burned all your bridges. But something will grievously wound you in time, if not undo you completely. In that passage that Tim read before from the Gospel of Mark, we read of the devil our arch enemy, if you like. And he's described by Jesus himself as a strong man, a strong man. He's stronger than us. He easily outguns our own resources and strength. We can't defeat him or his minions, if you like, by ourselves. He's too immensely strong and powerful for us. But there's one who's infinitely stronger. One so powerful that he kicks down the door and ties up that strong man. He utterly defeats him. He miraculously intervenes and saves Mark Lanigan from addiction and hopefully more. We all need saving, I believe. It's just whether we recognise it now or not. So will you reach out and accept that offer of salvation from our loving, glorious and all-powerful Father? It's worth thinking about. So thank you. And as always, please grab me afterwards if you've got any questions about any of this. And let me just wrap up with a quick prayer. Father, we thank you. We thank you for this message of encouragement. We thank you that we don't have to deny the fact or turn our backs on just our obvious experience that life is hard and difficult, and sometimes we all suffer at the hand of forces that seem beyond our control and our ability to be able to deal with. Thank you. Instead, we can rely on you, our glorious Father, whose treasured possessions we are. Thank you that you've demonstrated your power and your love for us, your rule and authority over every other malevolent force, circumstance, or self-destructive impulse that we have or that we sometimes suffer from. And I thank you that as we've read, your Spirit will be working on ours and just further convincing us of this day by day. I pray that it'll move from a belief that we can give intellectual assent to instead a conviction that we feel and that motivates us as we navigate the trials of life. Amen.